Salim, we ended off on our last video talking about, can Canada still work as a federation, a non-unitary state, to allow people in the West to feel at home in Parliament and in Canada, or in the East to feel at home? Because right now, of course, the population is all in Quebec and Ontario, and that's how you win elections in this country, is to win Ontario, or even to win a Quebec. The Laurentian elite, right, we continue to talk about. And there was a movement that we were involved in. It started off with Preston Manning in the West. The West wants in, as a sort of a consequence of Pierre Trudeau's national energy program, and treating Alberta especially as a second-class citizen, the energy-rich province, that we were just using them. And the West wanted in under Preston Manning, created the Reform Party, which was just the 4 Western provinces. And then he had the conference to allow it to run federally, and that became the Canadian Alliance, which eventually merged with the Progressive Conservatives to become the Conservative Party that we have today. So, in the last video we talked about, where did all that energy go? And why are we back to, again, separation talk happening in Alberta? Where did the energy go?
Well, it is a fascinating topic to talk about, and it is both complex and also dramatic. The energy that came out of the Western provinces, primarily Alberta, one of Canada's richest resource province, and that was the driving force, that they were not being given the due respect and due share in the running of the country. And so they wanted, instead of separating, wanted in. And that was the thing, that, you know, getting in, having a greater representation or a fair representation of the West in Ottawa would restructure, rebalance what had happened in the period after 1968, particularly in that critical period, 1980-82, or 1976-1982, when Quebec elected a separatist government of René Lévesque, and the stakes went up about patriation of the Constitution. And then finally the debate happened in 1980, and Trudeau, there's Pierre Elliott Trudeau, in a sense, came out of the debate with the promise that he's going to patriate the Constitution, and then the Constitution was patriated with a Charter of Rights and Freedom. And the drift began to what we were talking about previously, incrementally into Canada becoming a unitary state. And the more Canada became a unitary state, de facto, that is, Ottawa was running most of the policies and most of the issues without fair representation from the West in the decision-making and in the implementation. The alienation began. And so once Trudeau was gone, once the Conservative Party got elected, that was somehow dampened. But again, it got refocused, refired, rebooted by some of the decision. People have forgotten one of the decision at that time. You see, in the patriation period, drama, it was Quebec separatism, satisfying Quebec, keeping Quebec together, keeping Canada united. So in a sense, Laurentian elite you have talked about, and we need to talk a little more about that. I would now call them the establishment elites, because the Laurentian elite was in a particular time in the history of Canada, but now we are in the 21st century. The Laurentian elite has grown to recruit others, and it is their ideas, it is their value that has become now in more ways an obstacle to what we would call Canada with a more balanced federal-provincial relationship. So in the second act, in the Mulroney period, if you recall, Robert, the issue that really ignited once again, Western feelings of alienation and separation, was the award given by the Mulroney government and by Brian Mulroney himself. I think the decision was made when Manitoba and Winnipeg was the one making the bid for, I believe it was the repair, running of the bombardier planes or the Air Force planes. And Winnipeg was going to win the contract. I'm a little hazy about
and it goes
the
to
actual
Montreal,
detail.
probably,
Yeah,
right?
and they moved it to Quebec.
Yes.
Remember that?
F-16 contract?
Something of that. It
Yeah.
was it was the Air Force, aeronautics, avionics,
Right.
and Winnipeg was all geared up to win the thing, and the promise, I think, was there, and everything was there, and then at the last moment, Mr. Mulroney moved the contract to
his home province of Quebec. Yeah.
Quebec, exactly. That was in 1988, and I think that coincided, or that was the trigger that got the reform thing going. And so when the Mulroney government crashed, I think it was just before the 1988 election for Mulroney to keep the Quebec side happy, and which is where the votes were. And so that's, again, the federation is lopsided because of the nature of the votes we have in this country. That the energy then went into this argument. The West, instead of separating, wants in, and these are the condition, and the Triple E Senate was the condition that was put forward. Apart from balancing the budget, which became a Reform Party one of the big issues, an item, the Triple E Senate, elected, effective and equal.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what happened to that? Well, I mean, the long and short story comes into this context that the Reform Party was won. It became a national party. It was no longer a regional party. And so it became the opposition party. And the next step was a Unite the Right merger. And that succeeded. The Progressive Conservative reduced to 2 seats in the parliament, merged with the Reform or Canadian Alliance to reconstruct the Conservative Party of Canada. And the Conservative Party won of the first time in a minority situation, 2006 election, minority government, 2008 minority government, 2011 majority government. At the end of it, there was almost a decade of conservative government in Ottawa, a conservative prime minister in Ottawa, with a very substantive Western representation in Ottawa, from Alberta, from Saskatchewan, from Manitoba. And so the question, what happened? I would hazard the opinion that Mr. Harper failed the West. The Conservative Party failed the West.
Totally. I would agree.
Completely failed the West. Now you look back upon it and ask yourself the question, what did Mr. Harper's government, 10 years, what did they do that was significant in terms of legislative or constitutional discussion, conversation, and proposition to advance the federal-provincial relationship in a manner that would bring the West in, that would meet what the West has raised? And the answer is zilch.
Yeah.
Nothing. Mr. Harper's government is a total failure.
At least in that regard, yeah.
Yeah, a third party, a liberal party had become a third party, you know, with all of the scandals that had mounted up, ad scam and Schwanigan and so on during the Chrétien years, the 10 years, and then that Mr. Martin had to deal with those problems, and he couldn't, and he lost. First, he became a minority government. The majority that Chrétien had turned into minority in 2004, and in 2006, Martin was defeated. So here was the opportunity for the Conservative Party and Mr. Harper to do something substantive in the architecture of this country, in the terms of federal-provincial relationship. Now, I cannot recall in this 10-year period, in this decade, there was any major First Minister conference where Mr. Harper tabled any of these issues.
Could it be that when the PCs, Progressive Conservatives, merged with the Canadian Alliance to form the Conservative Party, that Stephen Harper, at least, was one of these elites, as you call it, the establishment elites, even though he didn't come from the elitist background, really. But he is sympathetic to that whole machine that Canada runs by and got sucked up into it and, again, ignored the West.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of truth to that. What happened now, in retrospect, we can see that the Progressive Conservative Party, the last government that they elected was the Mulroney government with two massive majorities in 84 and 88. And despite anything one has to say about Mulroney, there's at least one thing we must say, that Mulroney's great achievement was the free trade agreement with the United States, which became NAFTA, which is now dead under the Liberal government, died, but we're waiting for the US-Mexico-Canada Pact that will replace it to be signed and passed by the American Congress. So he did that. That was his signature achievement, and the harmonizing of the sales tax in terms of GST.
The excise tax was now visible as a GST.
Exactly, yeah. and so these two were the signature item of Mulroney and so on. But what was the PC? The PC, the Progressive Conservatives, was a marriage of convenience, you might say, marriage, opportunism, you might say, or what were the Conservatives of coming down from Johnny MacDonald, the successors of Johnny MacDonald, and those progressive during the Depression years. You know, in the prairie provinces, there was a rise of the Commonwealth Federation that became the New Democratic Party.
CCF became the
CCF
NDP,
became the New Democrats in the 1930s and 40s. And so they were more social democratic, socialist oriented, and so on.
They actually had associations with the communists as well.
They were, yeah.
People forget that
Yes.
the NDP today actually has its roots in communism.
So then there were those who were the Reds in that sense, and of course there was the famous, going even further back, the uprising in Winnipeg, I believe it was in 1919, the Red
The general
Uprising.
strike. Yeah.
So that tradition in the Western provinces was there. You know, that split on the one side went more social democratic and socialist, even you might say sympathetic to or leaning towards the communists, and on the other split was side where that they were progressive and tried to be progressive in that sense without becoming liberal, and they later on merged with the Conservative to create the Progressive Conservative
It's
Party.
funny that you say that because, of course, Johnny MacDonald in the first election ran for the Liberal Conservative Party.
There was that Liberal Conservative.
But of course, back in that time, liberalism and conservatism
Yeah.
are not what we think of today.
That's right. Because, again, the backstory is, if you go back all the way, I mean, the Conservatives in Britain are the landed aristocracy. So they are technically the Tories. And then comes about the breakup of the Tories in the 19th century, early 19th century, on the issue of trade, you know, and that leads to the making of the Whig Party that wanted more open trade, the Corn Laws, and the matter of you know, by opening up the trade that would undermine in some ways the landed interests, so Corn Laws, and that was the fight that brought about the creation of the Whig Party, which is the forerunner of the Liberal Party. But in North America, the Conservatives are not landed aristocracy in that sense. This is North America is built by settlers who were running away from the landed aristocracy of the empire of Britain or of France or of Europe. So the conservative are basically what, from our perspective now, we would say classical liberals. You and I, we are in that sense classical liberal, about individual freedom, responsibility, free market, smaller government that gives more space to the people, and rather centralization or control by the state, smaller state. So conservative liberal, I mean, that was the perfect balancing. I mean, and then the liberals become the ones that is much more, once 1867 and post 1867 politics of the late 19th century is where Lower Canada, that is Quebec, the Catholics, they rally around the red flag of the liberals, to protect their interests, their language, their culture within the Dominion. And so that's the breakup. So again, it is not based upon class division, it is more cultural and more, in that sense, philosophical division. But here you come back now, I mean, as I said, it's pointed out, we can break up Canadian history into packages of 50 years, 50 years, 50 years. So in the second 50-year package, we have this Depression years, this is between the two world wars, the prairie provinces that has been created by act of the Parliament. These were the Rupert land, the Hudson Bay land, that was then, created into provinces by the act of the federal government.
Certainly not by the will of the people.
Exactly. Unlike what happened in the United States. So what happened is that the reform movement and then subsequently reform that became Canadian Alliance was, in that sense, the more classically liberal-oriented conservative, if we maintain that distinction, freedom, responsibility, balanced government, small government. In a federation, the provinces should have their responsibility, and so on. The provinces, by the way, had opposed, and all the prairie provinces, all the western provinces had opposed the Prime Minister, Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, during the debate of patriating the Constitution. And they were not happy with the Charter because they in a sense, were apprehensive that of the centralization of power that would take place. The Charter would become an imposition. The Parliament would become, in that sense, degraded, because Parliament was supreme. Parliament can unmake or make whatever they want. In the end, it was the saying of the British Parliament, it can do anything the Parliament wants except make a man a woman and a woman a man. But now they can do that too with the modern technology. But the whole idea was it is the Parliament that's supreme. You see, Britain didn't have a written constitution. It was the laws, the statutes that the Parliament passed, and the common law.
Well, let's bring it back on track, though, with the Conservative Party of Canada, the failure of Stephen Harper to address the concerns of Western alienation.
So I'm coming
from
back.
There you get to Andrew Scheer.
Yeah, so the coming back to that is that when the party united, Canadian Alliance united with what was basically a dead or dying PC party and gave it the oxygen to grow, we can now look back and see it is the PC party that grew. PC party was the handmaid and the tool of the Laurentian elite, which is, and it swallowed, in a sense, it swallowed the Canadian Alliance, the Reform Party. In other words, PC, progressive and conservative, the marriage, the conservative were the blue Tories. They were the small c conservative, in terms of freedom and responsibility, provincial government, that is provinces, the rights of provinces. All of these were small c conservative thing. Supremacy of the Parliament, common law, precedents, etc. And the progressive were what Mr. Trudeau and the Liberals are, more centralization, that is making up more and more
red
of
Tories,
unitary, the red Tories, progressive, and so on. And Mr. Harper instead of protecting, defending, and leading the blue Tories, that is the original impetus of the Unite the Right movement, which is the Reform and Canadian Alliance, basically was suckered in, or willingly, or that was possibly his own state of mind. This is all thing that people will have to explore. But right at the outset, Mr. Harper's government, that is in 2006 coming in, after more than a decade of liberal government in the 1990s, 13 years of liberal government, from 1993 to 2006. So there was a lot of anticipation among all of us, you and I, we had all participated.
We worked to this end.
Yeah, we worked for it, and we all had participated. That, this will be a conservative government, and there were many issues that we wanted to see that the conservatives tackle it, that would be, in a sense, taking the fight to the establishment, or the elites, the Laurentian elites, their conception of Canada. The Laurentian elite conception of Canada is a centralized Canada. It's a Canada run from Ottawa by people who know each other from the school they have gone to, their relationship. It's again a tribal thing, who they're married, who their friends are, what school and university they've gone to, and more importantly, what over the last 50 years has become, that is the requirement of bilingualism and biculturalism, to which was added multiculturalism.
Yes.
And Western Canada is neither bilingual or bicultural in that sense, multicultural in that bastardized sense, yes. It's more multi-ethnic, but that's what these times, we all had that expectation that we will see a rebalancing taking place. But then Mr. Harper and his chief of staff, Tom Flanagan, talked about incrementalism, and that was a signal, you remember? Don't expect too much. It's going to be incremental. We're not going to rock the boat.
And Pierre Trudeau never did anything incrementally.
No, exactly.
It was always bang right over the head with all of these things.
Exactly.
He had the force of intellect and of power to get things done. While a Stephen Harper was like a caretaker government, just waiting for the next Liberal majority.
100%. And now that you look back upon it, you see Mr. Harper did not ignite any passion. He had no way to reach out to the people. Mm-hmm. He didn't go out and speak to the people. He did not explain to the people the problems of Canada in the 21st century.
It was as if once the Canadian Alliance and Conservatives merged with the PCs, problem solved, it's over, we don't have to think about it anymore.
Exactly.
Totally
On the
wrong.
issue of multiculturalism, they did nothing. They played with the one word diversity, but that's just, and then they dropped even that. So on all the critical issues, whether it was multiculturalism, whether it was CBC, but the critical issue is the balancing of the federal-provincial relationship, which we are talking about, there was no effort.
Yeah.
There was no effort. It was simply management of the central government. And there is no big legislative agenda that we can point to of the 10 years of the Harper government. So it came almost, as you said, as a caretaker government, because the liberal stink of corruption was so massive that people had moved away from voting for the Liberal, despite the efforts of the establishment elite to hold things together. And so the people voted for the Conservative. The Unite the Right came together, Conservative Party emerged. It was a new party in that sense. People voted, And the people who voted for them were basically in Ontario. Ontario voted for the Conservative. And of course, the West has been voting for the Conservative, in that sense. Ottawa did not, Quebec did not, and the Maritime did not. There was no substantive breakthrough in Maritime. Maritime with a dependency complex, and that lingering ties with the Laurentian elite. And Quebec with its unique, linguistic, cultural issues that has always kept Quebec in that unique, separate characteristic of the Canadian Federation. Did not embrace the Conservative as they had embraced Mr. Mulroney, who was seen as a Quebecois in that sense, and in 1984 and 88. So, well, again, we are back. It was Ontario. with its 121 seats. At that time, it was not 121. The numbers have expanded, but we are now 121 seats. Well, still the largest number of seats, the largest province. And so Mr. Harper did nothing about it. But that challenge remains. And how can we meet that challenge? Well, one of the obstacles is the Laurentian elites themselves. That is, the people who have run Canada. The bureaucrats, the politicians, the business elite, which is heavily dependent upon the state, so it is crony capitalism.
Well, I prefer the term cronyism.
Cronyism.
And I would not sully the word capitalism by even talking about cronyism.
So this is not with free trade. We had tried to open up the market, but we still remain very much in that framework. And the new immigrant population, which is a huge factor that has happened in the period since 1968. The growth in number that has taken place is new Canadians from outside of the European complex that has brought their own interests, own values under the this whole idea of multiculturalism, which plays perfectly into the hands of the establishment elite, because they don't have to, in that sense, define what is Canadian state and what is Canadian identity. That has always been, in some sense, you in your observation at times have talked about the inferiority complex, and this inferiority complex is the inferiority complex, I would say, of the establishment elite when they measure them and their mediocrity against the Americans.
Yes.
And so our politics has always been run as if on a reflexive mode. We are not Americans.
Yes.
Whether we are anti-American or pro-American, but we are not Americans,
Right.
Even though we are sitting on the top half of North American continent, And
it's so silly too, because America is such a great country.
It is. It is
and if you want to be against anything, why didn't you say, well, we're not European? With all their problems.
Yeah.
But no, we're not American.
So where we go, so we lean towards Europe, despite all the problems that, especially in the late 60s and early 70s with France and the fear of French intervention in Quebec politics when Charles de Gaulle came and
Vive Quebec Libre. Yes.
Yeah, exactly, and so on. Despite all of that tension, Pierre Trudeau's third option was to make Canada more European rather than closer relationship and ties with United States. And so ironically, it was Mulroney that opened up the free trade, which is the only natural thing about Canada. Mind you, the Liberal Party under Wilfrid Laurier had seen Canada and United States free trade thing. But at that time it was opposed by the Conservative because we were part of the British Commonwealth. We were part of the empire. And so in that sense, the inferiority complex, I think there is some truth in what you're saying in the larger sense of the making of Canada. Our evolution has been within the umbrella of the British Empire. But British Empire, as we progress over time, World War I, World War II, post-World War II, post-1945, coming to the centenary year, Britain was withdrawing from the empire. And by the time Canada celebrates the centenary year, 1967, the British Empire is gone. We are a Commonwealth country, but we no longer have the umbrella. And so Mr. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, instead of swerving towards the United States and tying the relationship with that, goes for the third option, that is Europe.
Well, not just Europe, though, Salim, because then he embraces China, he embraces Cuba,
that is
Fidel Castro.
That is his political inclination, you might say, his ideological, slant. He has been, in that sense, a man of the left, which again, as we see today in our contemporary politics, the people on the left are the multimillionaires and the billionaires. So this fascination of the people with money and the left is another story to dissect how that
The
happened.
George Soroses of the world. Now, of course, Stephen Harper, for all what we just discussed, not taking care of the West, lost the election. We get the likes of a Justin Trudeau now representing us internationally.
Yeah.
And then recently we've had, of course, Andrew Scheer take over the Conservatives. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Conservatives, how they've alienated the West just as much as the Liberals have. So you have the Conservatives here, Andrew Scheer being elected by the Quebec dairy cartel in a very suspicious way, burning ballots after they've been the 13th ballot, where Maxime Bernier was winning first 12. And now he comes on the stage, and all of a sudden, all conservative or any notion of conservative policies are thrown out the window. You now have a Tweedledum Tweedledee, liberal light, liberal heavy, with a Justin Trudeau. So is there any hope for the West or the rest of Canada outside of the Laurentians to feel at home in a Canada when the two governing main parties are both left-leaning, Laurentian, and establishment, and don't give a tinker's damn about Newfoundland politics or Alberta politics or Saskatchewan politics, and they can just do without them? Is there any hope with Andrew Scheer and the Conservative Party?
Yeah, I would say, yes, we need to be optimistic that we can do it, but we cannot do it. The remedy to our problem is within our own constitutional framework, but the remedy cannot be brought about by the establishment parties or the Laurentian elite. In my view, as we just discussed about Stephen Harper and the Conservative from 2006 to 2015, and the legacy of that, which is in terms of conservatism or conservative values in terms of federal-provincial relationship, is nothing, is zilch. It was a total failure, and in that sense, Mr. Harper will more and more become a footnote to history, that he did not do anything. And I think he was not capable of doing it, because now you can reflect upon it. He's not a man of big ideas, He was simply, in that sense, a tool maker or user of tool. He was fixated with balancing the budget, and that was his own, What was the 2011 campaign? He reduced the GST, from what it was, 6 or 5 to
7
4
to
or
5,
7 to 5.
But you would think that given a majority government, and we've only had 4 conservative majority governments in 90 years, 4. Diefenbaker, Mulroney, and Harper, and one other, forget. But 4 majority conservative governments. You think that with such a rare opportunity, he would take the bull by the horns and charge ahead with conservative ideas, bringing the West back in, reforming the Senate, and of course, zilch. Yeah. So what can we expect under an Andrew Scheer conservative government?
You're absolutely right. What we might say that from Diefenbaker through Mulroney, it is the PC government, and this is the establishment elite or the Laurentian elite. And one of the reasons that John Diefenbaker was defeated and removed was the coup inside the party, the night of the long night, led by the Newfoundland person, Dalton Camp, and his group, because of Mr. Diefenbaker's pan-Canadian vision that went somehow, on the into some sort of a contradiction or conflict with the Laurentian elite and their views. Their favorite candidate was Lester Pearson, who then subsequently defeated Diefenbaker. So in a sense, Harper government should have been outside of the establishment elite, coming from the West. It was the first prime minister in that sense with the majority government since Diefenbaker elected from the West with a substantive Western representation. And yet Mr. Harper's government ended up being just another tool of the Laurentian elite. He himself became a tool of the Laurentian elite, and there was nothing to show.
quite possibly the last majority Conservative government we will ever see, because what we
That,
have
that's
now...
been my, yeah.
Well, we've talked about this before. Andrew Scheer is leading the Conservative government or party now, and we have the most, arguably the most corrupt, ineffectual, embarrassing Prime Minister and Liberal government that this nation has ever seen, a laughing stock on the international stage, and Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives could not defeat them.
Absolutely. I said that, Robert, before the election. And I've been saying that. I think we have talked about it. I've said that to my friends. I've discussed it. Given what happened to me that we have talked about, I was with the Conservative Party, and then
I helped you with
was
that.
disallowed and removed from the party because of my position on Islamism. I pointed out that, the Conservatives are not going to form the government. The Conservatives will not win a majority, and if the Conservatives do end up forming a minority government, it can only be formed if there's a firewall, and that firewall can only be the PPC.
This is a good place to stop, because I'd like to tackle that in depth. The PPC, its rise with Maxime Bernier, the Andrew Scheer effect when he was elected, and where we go from here. So let's just leave it for now, Salim, and we'll resume this in another video with the PPC and the hope for Canada.
Yeah.